That's it for the announcements, and today's discourse is going to be on compassion. For those of you who are familiar with the different Buddhist traditions, you already know that compassion is one of the most important concepts of all of those different Buddhist traditions. It is taught that in order to relieve your own suffering, the suffering of others, the suffering of all creation, you need compassion. And it is only through compassion that suffering is released, you are freed from it, and you escape the cycle of rebirth. So what is compassion? I first would like to go over the difference between empathy and compassion, because some people actually confuse those two different concepts. They're very similar, so it is not surprising that there is confusion about these two different things. Empathy, however, is passive. When you empathize with somebody else, you have an understanding of their situation, of their condition, of what is causing them suffering. And you are able to put yourself in their shoes. You are able to walk a mile in their shoes. But with empathy, it ends there. You have the understanding, and you don't necessarily do anything about that understanding. And therein lies the difference between empathy and compassion. Compassion is, at least in the Buddhist tradition, active. With compassion, you have the same understanding of another person's situation, condition, and the cause of their suffering. But there is something more. There is also a selfless desire to relieve the suffering. And with that selfless desire, action is taken to relieve the suffering. So again, empathy passive, compassion active. So with that in mind, let's go a little deeper into compassion. You have these two components of it that I've shared. You have understanding, and then you have taking action. So let's focus initially on understanding. We can have an intellectual understanding of another person. But intellectual understanding is not enough for true compassion. With intellectual understanding, you can still be limited in terms of your understanding by prejudices, assumptions, conclusions. So in order for you to have true understanding of another individual, there needs to be pure love. Pure, unconditional love. This is what frees you from separation. This is what frees you from attachment. This is what frees you from limitation. It provides you with a universal conception of not only yourself, but others, and a universal understanding of the cause, the true cause of another being's suffering. If there is any judgment, if there is prejudice, if there are assumptions, if there are conclusions, you cannot be compassionate. So once we have understanding of another being based on love, we are able to take selfless action to relieve the suffering of that other being. Now, taking action can be very complex. Sometimes the best course of action is taking no action. Sometimes the best course is not saying anything, is not doing anything. In other situations, sometimes the best course might be founded in love, support. Sometimes the best course of action might be discipline, punishment. As the Bible says, there is a season for everything. And this is true with the action component of compassion. Even for the same individual. The same individual at a certain point in their life, the best course of action to be compassionate might be to do nothing. Years later, the best course of action might be love and understanding and support. A few months after that, the best course of action might be discipline, punishment. We have a season where the sun is shining in the summer and the spring, and we have seasons where the leaves fall off, the snow falls, but every one of these seasons is important for there to be life and for there to be progress. I wanted to give a few examples of compassion to let you know that compassion is not always black and white. Taking the right course of action really takes wisdom. Wisdom allows you to make those million right choices. With wisdom, there is impartiality, and very important here, unattachment. You're not attached to the individual. You're not attached to consequences. So impartiality, you are unattached, free from prejudice, and you have a universal mindset. It is through wisdom and the cultivation of wisdom that allows you to take right action to be compassionate. So here's a couple of examples. Not examples, they're really stories about compassion. And these stories are food for thought. They're something that after today, think about them and make your own decisions about who was compassionate or whether a certain action was compassionate. So the first story has to do with piranha. Those are the fish that some of you, or maybe all of you, know about. They tend to live in the Amazon, and they are voracious, and they basically eat everything. Well, there was an exhibit of piranha in a country that didn't normally have piranha. And a gentleman, he went to this exhibit, and he took a look at the piranha in the tank. And he felt that putting any type of living being in a cage caused suffering. That living beings cannot demonstrate their full potential when caged. So this gentleman decided that the compassionate thing to do with respect to the piranha was to free them. So one evening he goes to the zoo. He captures all the piranha. He takes them to the local river and he puts the piranha in the river. And he feels, my, what a great, compassionate thing I've done. I have freed these living beings from their captivity, and I have freed them from suffering. But by putting the piranha in the local river, what happened? The piranha ended up eating all of the indigenous fish. Killed all of the indigenous fish in the entire river. So was this gentleman's act of freeing and releasing the piranha compassionate. Is compassion towards one living being or a group of living beings at the expense of other living beings compassion? Is the potential for freeing one living being or a group of living beings from suffering while causing suffering to others compassion? And this is where wisdom, again, comes in. So let me give you another story, which will hopefully provide food for thought, about the true meaning of compassion. So in this story, we have a fictitious country that believes in law and order. Their whole society functions because of this belief in law and order. Well, there is a gang in this country and a leader of the gang, and this is a violent gang. They don't buy into this law and order message of the country. And this leader of the gang ruthlessly murders multiple people over the course of several years. He is caught and imprisoned. And the law in this country is that for murderers like this gang leader, they are put to death. Now, there are a couple of jail guards, and they feel that the compassionate thing to do is to not put this gang leader to death. They believe that execution of any living being is not compassionate. So although the warden tells them that they need to execute this gang leader, they refuse. For several weeks, they refuse to execute the gang leader. And what happens during these several weeks? This country of law and order starts falling into rioting and discord because the law is not being followed. Through these riots, businesses are burned and damaged, property is stolen, and people are physically harmed. The warden of the jail decides that really the compassionate thing to do is to execute the gang leader. And his view of compassion has to do with the society as a whole. He is viewing the owners of the businesses who are having their businesses destroyed and their property stolen. He is looking at the people who are being harmed in these riots. So this warden of the jail calls in the military. The military comes and the military executes the gang leader. So the question in this story is, Who was compassionate? The jail guards who refused for several weeks to execute the gang leader, or the warden who called in the military to put him to death? The question becomes, again, if you are relieving the suffering of one and yet causing suffering for others, is that a compassionate action? And this is a complicated question again, one that requires wisdom to fully appreciate and understand what is to be done. Some might argue that the jail guards were compassionate. Some might argue that the warden was compassionate. Some might argue that both were compassionate. In order to exercise compassion, there must be this pure love. There must be kindness. There must be an awareness of what action or non-action you are taking, how it affects all beings, all life. It is a universal mindset. There's a couple other things I wanted to talk about with respect to compassion. Compassion is ideally something that you are doing in every moment of every day. Every single person is capable of compassion at one time. And one compassionate act might provide some benefit. But the goal again is compassion at all times. It is through compassion at all times that you achieve the Buddhic mindset. It is through compassion at all times that you relieve suffering of yourself and all beings. There's another story I wanted to share that hopefully brings this into light. Like I said before, every person is capable of compassion at one time. And this story has to deal with a very evil person. This person is very self-centered and rarely does anything for anyone or anything which does not benefit himself. One day, however, as he's walking in town, he comes across a spider on the ground. And his first inclination is to raise up his foot and stamp the spider and kill it. But he decides not to. As he raises his foot and he puts it over the spider, he pauses and decides he's going to let the spider live. Some would say an arguably compassionate act. So at the end of this evil person's life, he dies and goes straight to hell. And he's suffering in hell, along with many others. One day, above his head, he sees a little string of webbing from a spider coming down into hell. And he reaches up and he grabs the web. And the spider starts pulling him up and pulling him up out of hell. But a bunch of other people that are also suffering in hell see this gentleman being pulled out. And they want to be saved too. They don't want to stay in hell for eternity and suffer. So they start jumping up And they're grabbing onto the gentleman's feet and legs and trying to hang on to him as he's being pulled out of hell. And so what does this evil person do? He wants to be saved, and he thinks that if all these people are hanging on to him, this thin piece of web is going to break and he's going to be stuck in hell. So, pursuant to his normal course, he thinks about himself and he starts kicking all of these people off. Kicking them off his feet and kicking them off his legs. And by doing that, this string of web breaks and they all fall back down into hell. The point of this Buddhist story is that one act of compassion can prove beneficial. This evil gentleman's act of compassion of not killing the spider did benefit him. He could have been saved. And yet he fell back to his true nature, which was not compassionate. And the end result was that he suffered in hell for eternity. With the moral of the story being, be compassionate, not just once, not just twice, but at every moment of every day. There's one final comment I wanted to make about compassion. It's easy to be compassionate to those that you love. It's easy to put yourself in their shoes, to understand any suffering that they are going through, and to take action through wisdom to relieve their suffering. It's much, much harder to be compassionate for people you hate and despise. To be compassionate towards people that you don't believe deserve compassion. This is very similar to what is discussed in the Bible, where it talks about loving and forgiving your friends and your family and your loved ones. That's easy. Loving and forgiving your enemy, that is hard. But what is taught by the Buddhists is that in order for compassion to relieve the entire created world of suffering, you must have compassion for every living being. For your family, for your loved ones, for those you hate, for those you despise, for every creature, for every plant, for every elemental. For it is only through compassion for everything that exists that violence will be turned into harmony, separation will be turned into unity, and hatred will be turned into love. So that's what I wanted to share today. And now we have time for a deep level meditation.